Welcome back to the channel, my friends. It has been a while, but I have a pretty crazy and different e-bike build for you today. As you can see from this very strange looking frame, yes, this is a crappy Walmart frame e-bike build, which if you've seen my channel, you know I like to do a lot of, but this one's a little different. This frame is pretty unique, and it's actually not the lowest tier. It's got disc brakes. The main triangle is actually made out of 6061 aluminum. And the cool thing is that the rear swing arm subframe is made out of steel. So I thought that would be an interesting e-bike, especially for a high powered hub motor, because your dropouts and all that stuff that needs to be reinforced is made out of steel, but then the main tube and all the front end is all aluminum. So I figured you could get the lightweight of aluminum and also the strength of the steel where you need it, and we can make something pretty crazy. I picked this kit up from NBpower, and this is their 72 volt 3 kilowatt kit, but if you look at the controller, it's actually 80 amps, which is more like 6 kilowatts. I think we'll actually do 120 peak or for short bursts, and that's more like 10 kilowatts. So anyway, it's a beast, and it even comes with some very cheap torque arms, which you definitely will use, but you know how much I love torque arms, so I'll show you my solution to that later. Comes with a nice screen. It also comes with a alarm system, which I'm not going to be throwing on it, but it is kind of cool that it comes with the kit. I've made enough e-bikes now that I know what to ask the sellers before they ship it to me, and I knew that they were going to send me a single speed freewheel, and I want a 7-speed cassette because this bike has gears, or the original one did, and I wanted to preserve that. Not that you need it with 5 kilowatts, but they told me that they cannot send me a 7-speed cassette and only a single speed freewheel because it would not fit in the dropouts, which I can understand why they would say that, but I was like, well, I'm going to put it on anyway. And they're like, no, that's impossible. These MTX wheels are pretty high quality, but the only thing I don't like are these obnoxiously large stickers. And I've done this so many times that I've got it down to a science of pulling these off pretty much straight shot one go with almost zero residue left over. And that little bit at the end, you can just use the rest of the sticker and pull it up, and you don't have to clean it off or use alcohol or anything. It just comes off one straight go. Now, when the sellers told me that it was impossible to fit a 7-speed cassette, then of course I had to do it. And I was going to do it anyway, no matter what it took, but it actually wasn't that hard, although I do understand why they wouldn't want to send it in the kit, and that's because it is a bit tighter of a fit, and you will need to get a little innovative with your spacer or washer stacking to get the appropriate spacing without binding on the frame. One of the most challenging parts of building a hub motor e-bike kit is just mounting the motor, and I've seen tons of people run into issues because they're unfamiliar with kind of how it all works. Even though it is very simple, it's very easy to have things that are binding that you're not exactly sure where they're binding or what's causing an issue, but having the proper amount of washers and how they're spaced is very, very important. I actually had a viewer reach out to me on Instagram because he was having the exact same issue that I was having when installing this motor. And even though everything looks like it's properly spaced apart, there's nothing that's visibly binding. The frame is not touching the cassette, and everything looks like there's plenty of space for everything to be moving freely. When you tighten down on the axle nuts, then the motor doesn't move, or it moves with a ton of binding. Unfortunately, this trips up a lot of people who are new to building hub motor e-bikes, and a lot of the times they don't give you enough washers that are going to be able to space out the axle from your freewheel. And a lot of people will just throw on a washer and go, yeah, this is how you do it. But then when you tighten down the axle, it's actually going to be squeezing against the freewheel. As you can see from the wear marks on this washer, that is a ton of binding to the point where it's not spinning freely. And the solution to that is you need to find a washer a stack of washers or a pipe that I'm using an old seat tube here, something that is small enough to go inside of the cassette, but large enough to fit around the axle. And I just cut to length a perfect spacer that is going to allow me to screw down very tightly the axle, and it's not going to have any binding anymore. So if you're having issues with binding and you don't really know where to look, definitely check this place first. Now, why did I choose this crazy frame when the sensible thing to do is just buy a traditional hardtail mountain bike with a giant triangle for a pre-made battery that fits very easily. You could put a hub motor, you could put a mid-drive, but that triangle is perfect for a battery. If you have a full suspension bike, that's going to be much more difficult because you have rear suspension components invading your triangle battery space. Although I was able to make it work with a very tiny battery on this mid-drive build that I did before. I'm pretty bored with making regular e-bikes, so I chose a frame where the triangle where you would normally put a battery is completely filled with suspension and frame components. So yeah, you could put a hub motor, but where in the world are you going to put a battery on this thing? I specifically chose this frame because it was going to be a huge challenge. And sure, could you throw a battery on your backpack and wear a battery and become a battery? Yes, that is one solution. Could you have some sort of rear rack set up where you put a battery hanging off the back? Yes, you could, but I want to integrate a battery, and there's not a lot of good places for that. There's a tiny little triangle here, but I need a big battery, and that's not going to be big enough. If I put one here, it's going to run into the tire. So I am no stranger to fitting gigantic batteries into places that they're not supposed to go. I don't know if you guys remember, but I stuffed this giant 70 amp hour battery into an enduro frame, which it certainly wasn't designed to accept that. But I enjoy the challenges. I like it when companies tell me, no, you can't do that, it's impossible. Of course it's possible. You just have to be determined and maybe think a little outside of the box, no pun intended. But if you want to do something, figure it out, make it work. I knew from the start that this build, I was not going to be able to just buy some regular battery or even have one custom made, because the dimensions that I need are so complicated that I don't think I would be able to even describe to somebody, hey, I need it to be built this exact way. So that left me with one option, and that was to build my own battery. I've actually never built a battery, even though I've built like 30 to 40 e-bikes at this point. And the reason is very simple. You don't save all that much money building it yourself because you need all the supplies, you need the tools to do it. And plus it's dangerous when you're dealing with 72 volts and, you know, hundreds of amps. It can get kind of scary to build your own pack, especially if you have no idea what you're doing. If you're unfamiliar with building batteries, it seems like it's very complicated. And once you figure out kind of how it works, it's not all that complicated. If you want me to make a dedicated video on how to actually make a battery, assemble it, like a how-to, I will do that. But again, I've built like 3 or 4 batteries by the time I'm recording this voiceover, but when I was building this was my first pack, and part of that is just choosing the cells that you need and making sure you have enough amperage. After cross-comparing a ton of different batteries, I ultimately settled on the EVE 33Vs. They're not the best discharge, they're not the best amp hour, but they are at the right price, and I'll get into batteries more in a little bit, but I now had to fit them onto this frame, and how was I going to do that? This job would have been much easier if I had a 3D scanner, which I don't, so I had to do it the old-fashioned way. And here is a mock-up of the frame rail that I'm going to be essentially assembling the battery around. If my model is not making sense yet, don't worry, it will. Here in green is the first rows and module of batteries that I'm going to be trying to attach to the frame, and I'm going to be using 3D printing. I'm not only going to be using plastic because I'm going to be reinforcing it with metal, but this is essentially how I came up with how to stick a bunch of batteries around this frame. And as you notice, I have provisions for where the power wires and BMS wires are going to go to the controller. And then I also have provisions for where this module is going to connect up to the other modules in the series. And I have ways to secure the top clamshell to the bottom, and it's also going to have windows, which I thought was going to be a cool, little accent for that. Here is the second module and rows of batteries that is going to be sitting under the frame, and I have to make sure that I have enough room for where that shock component is going to be. You're seeing this in Fusion 360, and no, I did not just sit down with some measurements and then build everything out just like that. This took me an extremely long time with many iterations on this design. This is by far the biggest and most complicated 3D model that I have ever made. I also don't have the best 3D printer, so I had to design this in mind with being able to print it with the printer that I have. You'll notice I have some column provisions with holes in them, and I'll show you right now how that is going to fit up in the design. This is the bottom case, the bottom module, and I do have some aesthetic elements which I added later, but here's pretty much this row of batteries, and here's one of the side things, and as you can see, I have threaded steel rods that are going through the design that is going to help hold it all together. And then I'm going to essentially attach it around the frame. But as you can see, there's already a problem going on. This is where having a 3D scanner comes in handy, because this would not have been a problem, but somebody was measuring things wrong, and that somebody was me, because I'm the only one working on this project. And I wanted to definitely make sure I left room, but now I'm going to have to move this backwards and make a provision for where that upper shock mount is. And so I'm going to have to modify this design, or at least trim some of this to make it fit, and then update the design accordingly, because that is getting in the way. Now, for the sake of brevity, because this video is already going to be way too long, I am not going to show you every single problem that I encountered when trying to build this 3D enclosure, but this was just one of the many problems that I encountered, and some of them were self-imposed, some of them were not, but this is what happens when you try to do things that are hard. Now that my cells finally arrived, I can start assembling the modules, and again, these are the EVE 33Vs, which at the time that I made this bike, these were the best bang for buck. Even in the past 2 years, you're seeing significant performance gains in battery technology. You're seeing cells with double, triple, quadruple the amount of amp discharge, plus double the amp hours in the same size. And so at the time, these were the best bang for buck, but I would definitely have chosen different cells if I was building this now. Because this was my first pack, I wanted to do it as safely as I possibly could. I've seen a ton of people just hot gluing cells together and sticking them as close as possible, and other questionable things where they're putting themselves in danger while they're building it, but also like for the longevity of the pack, maybe it's not going to be the most integrated or well built. And I'm not saying the way I'm building it is perfect, but I'm trying my best to do it in a way that is going to be a good quality battery. Using these cell holders not only adds structural rigidity, but it also allows an air gap for temperatures between the cells, which is also nice. When laying out and assembling your battery, you want to be very careful with these series parallel connections, because you could easily cause a short circuit, which would be very bad. Another thing that can help is using these fish paper washers. Is basically like a small cardboard gasket that goes between your nickel strips and the battery. I did this on both sides. I think you really only have to do one side. I'm not sure. I was just overdoing everything, just making sure everything is going to be as safe as possible. You want to try your best to align them, and this can be a very tedious task, because if you have 160 cells, this is doubled, so you have to do both sides. That's like 300 stickers you're putting on these cells. The reason why you would do this is because your nickel strips can cut through the insulation on the cells, and the outside of the cell is entirely ground. So if you do that, it's going to short and you're going to have a bad day. Another safety measure is cutting the edges of the nickel strips, and I did this to prevent shorts. I don't know if it was absolutely necessary, but again, I'm taking every precaution to do this the correct way. I went with the 0.2 nickel strips because they're a lot thicker, but you need a pretty powerful spot welder to do that, and thankfully I was able to find one that wasn't that expensive, and it actually can blast through the 0.2 nickel strips. If you go this route, you will need a car battery or some high-powered LiPo that can output the amperage that you need. I first tried making this pack with one of those portable spot welders, but that was not working at all for this thick of nickel strips. You definitely need one that has a lot of power to get through it and make good connections. The portable one I bought actually was more expensive, and it couldn't do it even though it was advertised to work with this size nickel strips. This one worked really well. I don't remember what it's called, but I'll try to link it in the description. When I'm using the spot welder, I am using rubber gloves, and that has more to do with the fact that those wires and those electrodes actually heat up quite a bit when you're using it. I'm not that concerned with electrocuting myself. I'm making sure I'm not wearing any metal on my hands or wrists, and I'm also taping off and covering every part of the battery that I'm not currently working on. I've found that when laying down these strips, using some blue tape actually helps keep them in place and not move around so much, so you can get things pretty symmetrical. I tried my best, although it's not perfect. Some of them are a little bit off, but as long as they're making good connections, that's the most important part. If I was going to be doing this again, I would have gone ahead and bought the nickel strips that already have a cross section like this. They're almost like a rectangle that you buy and you can trim it to size. They also make pure copper ones, which is nice, and I probably would have gone with that. Although I think even 0.2 millimeter is overkill for the power level that this battery is going to be outputting. Spot welding is pretty easy and you can get into like a flow state, but when you have this many cells, it still takes a long time. I will admit that I am far from a Fusion 360 expert or 3D modeling expert, but Fusion is really good when you are just building something up, but when you want to go back and make changes, a bunch of weird stuff can happen and things that you didn't think would happen. Like, did I accidentally print these ridges through my mounting holes, which are supposed to be just solid holes through? Yes, I did. Is it my fault? Ultimately, yes, but I'm still going to blame the software. Here is the bottom module that's going to be going on the bike, pretty much completed, although I did make provisions to add some foam that not only is on the bottom, it goes all the way around the perimeter of the battery and then also on top of the battery. I could have done away with this step and it would have been fine. I just think that overall the longevity, if you have some sort of cushion between your cells and the frame, it's not going to hurt anything and it's not going to add that much width to the battery enclosure, so I'm going for it. Again, the theme of this battery build is safety overkill, and even though they're totally encased in plastic, so there's no way that they could touch metal, I'm still putting extra layers of fish paper, even though they have Kapton tape first, then fish paper, then foam. It's totally overdone, and again, I could have been fine with just the 3D printed enclosure and the cell holders, but hey, better safe than sorry. I know I'm spending a lot of time showing you guys this battery build, but that is essentially this project, which is a giant battery that is wrapped around a bike frame. Obviously, this is a big pack, but let me tell you, this bike's range is insane. And to think that I could have gone with like 5,000 milliamp cells, these are only 3,300. To be able to get almost like 40% more range out of this would be ridiculous. I didn't want to just tape or slap together these plastic pieces onto the frame, so what I did was drilled 3 holes through the frame, and I'm putting, I think this is 3/8 or 5/16 rod through the entire frame that interfaces with all of the 3D printed parts. So it has a ton of rigidity, and basically the 3D printed parts become a part of the frame. So I have the bottom module in place, and now you can see where I'm starting to put the top modules on and how they are going to fit onto the frame. I basically maxed out as much length as I could with the battery cells so that this bike wouldn't end up being too wide. Also, if you notice, I have faced all of the printing on the cells to be outwards, and I did that on purpose as a design choice because I think barcodes are cool looking. Here you can see just some of the prints that I went through when designing this top part, and remember when I had to shift that bottom module backwards? Well, that required me to move where all of the rods were going through, which then I had to shift those down. So as you can see, these pieces, they used to be on the left was the one before, then it shifted backwards on the right. Again, I'm just showing you guys that I didn't just CAD this up and then print it off one rip and then it was done. Like, I had a lot of trial and error and getting things to fit correctly. I wish I could tell you guys how much measuring went into making these parts, because I had to provision for everything. You have to make room for where the foam is going to sit. You have to make room, like, everything is a choice, and everything has its own space within the confines of the space that you have allotted. So getting these things to line up perfectly without things rattling around or being too tight to where they don't fit, it took a lot of effort. So after all that, you can understand my satisfaction when I have everything in place and it slides in like a glove, like perfectly. There's no rattling around or movement, and everything just fits and sits exactly where I want it to be. 3D printing is pretty flexible though, and a lot of things that if you don't print them correctly and you just need to make a minor adjustment, it's totally fine to just hack it up. But thankfully I was able to get these cutouts, all the provisions for where the wires were going to go, everything was working out. Here I am testing another top module, and this is how I would do it. Would make a print, check everything that fits, then go test it on the bike frame and make sure it fits up with all the other parts that are on there without any problems or things running into each other. And here's how you can see how I connected the three pieces of the top module together. I have these hexagonal kind of interfaces, and even those I printed them too tight, and you know, all of these tolerances, thankfully, I could just massage these and make them fit. But again, it goes to show that, you know, there's a lot of different dimensions that all need to slot and fit together with these types of builds. Sometimes there's no way around just making a new print, but I always try to use the prints that I have, especially if it's a part that just needs a little bit of trimming and it's not going to be seen. The rod length is actually very critical. If you cut them too short, then you basically got to use them for a different project. And if you cut them too long, then they're not going to look really good because there's going to be a bunch of threads sticking out where you don't want them to. Now, if you guys haven't figured out, I'm essentially making one battery, but using three separate sections of that battery. According to the BMS, it goes to every cell, and so it knows that it's one battery. But for ease of installation and removal, I've made it so that I can take these apart in sections. Here's a detailed view of one of the top modules, and you can see my tolerances, and I have provisions for foam, but also a little air gap between the acrylic clear side panels. Another added benefit of these clear side panels is not so much that they look cool, but it's also material that I don't have to print. So these prints are printing faster because I don't have to print that entire wall. I know this might just look like a box to you, and it kind of is just like 3 boxes, but this is by far the most complicated 3D model that I have made thus far. At this point in time, I have made more complicated ones, which I will show you, but this thing is pretty crazy. And these panels, because I figured, you know what, the plastic is probably fine, but what if I reinforced everything with metal. So the metal is going to be directly tied to the steel rods that are going through the plastic, and it's basically going to sandwich and pancake together the entire thing, which is then bolted through the frame. And because of that triangular piece in the frame, I needed a way to be able to add and remove this entire top plate because it has to be disconnected somewhere. So I figured just making like a washer, essentially like this giant brace, is going to help with that. I did quite a few experiments with how to make this top brace, and originally I was going to come in from the side and have like a side brace where it slips past that triangle part, but I eventually went with the design I showed previously because it's less complicated, it's a little more symmetrical. And the other thing is, these are going to be made out of aluminum, and I don't have a plasma cutter yet, but I will say that if you're having a service like Send Cut Send make these panels for you, the more cuts you have, the more expensive it is. So I originally had these crazy designs with a bunch of relief cuts and everything, but I eventually simplified it just because it was gonna like double or triple the cost of the piece, and I figured I could get away with having some of those design elements, but it's not like my full design. Or I should say my ideal design is more complicated than what I eventually went with. So now we need to throw the BMS on top of this giant pancake structure. I also need room for a bunch of wires that are going to be going through and attaching to all the things, the various components inside of that BMS compartment. And there's where the triangle starts. I know I didn't make that in 3D space, but you can kind of get an idea of why I needed that plate to go around the triangle. Also need to add the controller somewhere, so that is going on top of the BMS compartment, and now you can see how this thing is starting to take shape. So I needed holes to mount the BMS enclosure on top, then I needed holes to mount the controller on top of the BMS mount, and there's a lot of holes for a lot of things, and then you need space for wires to go through, and it's just a lot of things to think about, and hopefully you get right on the first print. Then I experimented with, okay, I have a bunch of wires coming from the controller and it's kind of ugly. So I experimented with a bunch of different like clamshells on top of that to just cover and hide most of the wires that are coming out of the controller. I tried a bunch of different designs. Some were simpler, some were a little more complicated, and eventually came up with this thing that not only would allow a bunch of wires to be hidden behind it and under it, but kind of went with the rest of the frame design and kind of like a flow with going into that triangle section. You'll see when it's on the bike, but this is kind of like the full 3D render here. And I can show you a view without all the internal lines on, and this is kind of how it's going to look when it's completed. And this is, I don't know how many hours in Fusion, but it's a lot. There's a lot. The only thing left to do is place an order for some metal parts and wait for them to arrive in the mail. I am not sponsored by Send Cut Send, but I wish I was because I love their service and I will shout them out regardless if they're paying me or not. I will pay them and still shout them out because I think that they are awesome. This company always under promises and over delivers, especially with like turnaround times and shipping and all that. They'll tell you, oh, it'll take a week, but then they'll ship it the next day and it's already done. It's totally crazy, and the parts quality is incredible, and it's, for what it is, it's pretty cheap. I mean, it's basically you're paying for material costs and you're getting laser cut custom parts. Before I make an order, if I'm weary about if something is going to fit, I always print out a paper template and just visually look. Is it going to look how I want it to look, and are things looking like they're going to line up? This is a good way to make sure you don't make a glaring mistake that costs a lot of money. Does this extra step take a bit of time to cut things out and make sure it's cut out exactly so you know it's going to fit up? Yes, it does take a little bit of time, but it is totally worth it. I think you guys can see why I needed to make this top plate out of 2 pieces, because that triangle bar right there is not, like, you're not going to just put a plate on that. It needs some sort of way to get around that, and so that's why I made the little brace at the bottom. When placing this down for the first time, there was an issue, and it was that center hole right there in the top. And it wasn't because the part was cut wrong, it was because the rod was slightly angled, because I couldn't cut a perfectly centralized hole in the frame, but all I did was carve it out a tiny bit. It was like a millimeter or two, just chopped it out with a Dremel, and then it fit perfectly. And obviously there's the lower brace that goes on the bottom. Here is all the parts slowly being stuck on the bike, and as you can see, I have a lot of wires going on. Now I think you guys know why I wanted to cover up some of these wires. It's like a big, multicolored spaghetti mess that wouldn't fit with the rest of the design of this bike. I mean, it's all black and silver essentially, and then you have like a bunch of different colors. There's all my BMS wires that have to go up through and connect to the BMS on top of the battery. This was basically just a test fit, and now that I know that all the parts are going to fit exactly how they're supposed to, now I can disassemble this whole structure again and finally put all the batteries inside, and then also connect everything together. And for the BMS, I really didn't know which one to choose from. There are a whole bunch of different manufacturers and models, but I just picked one from JK as I read a bunch of positive reviews about them, and I picked one that fit the specs of this battery. You just have to make sure you get one with enough series connections, because there's like some 20S, there's 24S, or some 26S. As long as you pick one that fits your battery setup, then everything should be fine. One thing I was concerned about was the inter-module connections, because I essentially have 3 modules that I need to connect together, and for those I use XT90 connectors, which will do 90 amps, and I essentially am using both channels, both buses on the XT90 as one connection. So this should be way more than enough headroom. This is just overkill essentially for the interconnects. Plus the wires are very short, so the resistance should be very, very minimal. I'm getting down to the end here. I just have to finish up these modules and then try to stuff all kinds of wiring underneath my 3D printed panels. at how many wires I stuffed under this 3D printed part. I could have made it taller and that would have helped me a little bit, but I was trying to make this as slim as I possibly could without it being too cumbersome, but I think I should have gone with another couple millimeters. This build came out way better than I ever expected it would. There was a couple times where I was deeply questioning if this was even going to work out at all, but I persevered and came through, and I think it looks really cool. It has exactly what I was going for, which is an extremely unique look. I don't know a lot of e-bikes that have like a crazy frame design like this, especially with a battery design that's like this. I mean, it's very boxy, it's very angular. To me, it has a lot of cyberpunk elements that, of course, I enjoy. I also made my own custom torque arms, which I made a video on how to make your own very strong custom torque arms. Everybody who knows me knows I love some torque arms, but this build definitely needed them. Not only does this build look really cool, but it performs incredibly. This bike is insane. This bike has 5 power levels, but you really only need level number 2 because anything past that is just extra layers of insanity. It's not really about the top speed because honestly, this bike, I'll show you in this video, but it goes 52 miles an hour and it could probably go even faster, but it's really all about the acceleration. This bike accelerates so quickly that it honestly rivals my enduro bike, and I actually think it might be faster or quicker. My enduro, I went 60 miles an hour, so this one I went 52, but they're two totally different platforms. This is like a regular bicycle. This is where the power to weight ratio really plays its role, because even though it has about half the power as my enduro bike, it also weighs half as much. So honestly, the performance is probably going to be very similar. And the performance on that bike is already totally crazy, but having a much lighter frame and lighter everything, this bike probably only weighs about 65-70 pounds at the most. When I say that this bike is stupid, like, it is literally stupid to put this much power on a mountain bike frame. This is a bicycle and it's going over 50 miles an hour and the acceleration is just absolutely brutal. I used to care so much more about having a bike that can go really fast, but after making multiple builds that can do highway speeds, it's honestly pointless and it's just not fun. It's not comfortable to go that fast. Sure, it's exhilarating, but it's just dangerous. It's just scary and it's dangerous and it's not fun, for me at least. I mean, if you're an adrenaline junkie, go for it, but as far as I'm concerned, having like speeds that go over 40 on a bicycle, it just doesn't really matter. Like, who cares? Like, yeah, whether your bike goes 50 or 100 or 200, it doesn't really matter, because over 40 it starts to get sketchy. I've already made a video explaining my reasoning on why building a high-powered e-bike, anything over 1500 watts or goes faster than 35 miles per hour, is not only dangerous, unsafe, it's also very expensive, and it's just a waste of time, when you could easily just buy a motorcycle that does all those things for less and does it way better for cheaper. Now, having said that, I will admit that this build is extremely fun to ride. The acceleration just puts a smile on your face no matter what, and the full suspension is definitely the way to go. Any new builds I make, I don't know if I can go back to hardtail. Definitely can't go back to no suspension, but I think full suspension, if you're going to build a fast bike, is the way to go. Here you can see on the GPS, 52 miles per hour was my top speed. I honestly probably could get it faster, but why would you need to? Who cares? The other awesome thing about having this gigantic battery on this bike is the range. I have gone on 30 to 40 mile rides and still had 80% of the battery left. I am confident that this thing can go 80 to 120 miles, and that's going about 22 to 25 miles per hour average. That is an insane amount of range. I'm thinking of doing a price breakdown on this build and any of my older builds, so let me know if you want to see a video on this bike or any of my other bikes or projects that you want to know how much things cost and what it took for me to build them. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Would you change anything? Would you make it different? I'm very curious as to what you all have to say. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. I know it was a very long video, but I appreciate it. And I will be uploading more videos sometime soon. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.